Jesus said, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." When Jesus talks about the law and the prophets, we sometimes forget, I think, that he is a Jew talking to other Jews about their own scriptures. The law is the Torah in Hebrew, the 5 books of Moses. And the prophets names the other main part of the Jewish scriptures. So when we talk about and study the Bible, for us, it is what? Generally Christians talking to other Christians about it. But what would it mean? Would it be different in some ways to think about passages like this morning's gospel in terms of Jews talking to other Jews about their own scriptures? This week I wrote, I think, an important newsletter column trying to continue to talk about what I consider basically a 40-year conversion that I've undergone during my time as a pastor. And as I mentioned there, I'd like to keep laying that out bit by bit, and this morning, no different. A big component of my conversion have been the huge changes that biblical scholarship has undergone. As a pastor, I need to read those scholars and be informed, and the entire field of biblical study has changed greatly in the last 40 years, and then it becomes a challenge for me as your pastor to try to pass some of that on to you. An important factor in that change is that the field is no longer dominated by mostly white men. Women and people of color have brought new perspectives. And related to that category of change is that Jewish scholars have entered the scene, not just in Old Testament studies, but also in New Testament studies. E.P. Sanders was the first to make a big impact. He wrote a book on St. Paul in 1977 that began to change the landscape pretty dramatically. And then a book on Jesus and Judaism in 1985. Both these books really changed things greatly. As Christian scholars were introduced in a way to the world of Jews talking to other Jews about their own scriptures. It's huge. Jesus and Paul were Jews. Their entire lives and thinking were shaped by their being Jewish. And over 2,000 years, Christians have gradually lost the sense of being able to read and understand our Christian scriptures as they mostly were at the outset. Namely, Jews talking to other Jews with their own scriptures in their hearts and minds. One of my favorite New Testament scholars right now is Amy Jill Levine of Vanderbilt University. And she's Jewish. And I've enjoyed reading her little book this week on the Sermon on the Mount. She begins the book by sharing that she first read the Gospel of Matthew when she was 13 or 14. Now remember, she's Jewish, grew up in the synagogue, but she became interested and at 13 or 14 read the Gospel of Matthew. And then again, as a freshman in college, when she took a class on the New Testament. And she confesses at the beginning of this book on the Sermon on the Mount that those first encounters with the Gospel of Matthew, she basically skipped over the Sermon on the Mount. And she describes why. When I mentioned to my Christian friends, she says, whether in high school or in my first year of college, that I was interested in biblical studies, and especially in the New Testament, many of these friends sang the same song. Oh yes, they said, we learned a lot about Jesus in church. We learned that he came to fix Judaism, which had gone downhill from the good old days of Abraham. Problems started with Moses and the law, and then they got increasingly worse. The Jewish system was legalistic, misogynistic, xenophobic, violent, lacking in mercy, and otherwise a mess. That's why, they told me, Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. With his comments about, you've heard it said, but I say to you, to replace the Torah's eye for an eye, for example, with Jesus's turn the other cheek. And we'll begin that part of the Sermon on the Mount next week. But that's why, she said, they told me Jesus had to teach his followers how to pray because the Jews had forgotten. Who wants to read a sermon if the whole point is to show that Judaism has evolved into something disgusting? Well, obviously, Professor Levine has since read the Sermon on the Mount and treasures it as one of the greatest texts in human history. But again, she's able to do so by knowing from her own experience what it is like to hear it in terms of Jews talking to other Jews about their scriptures. That thing that she mentions, you've heard it said, but I say to you, which we start next week, these have been called antitheses by Christian scholars, as if Jesus is somehow presenting 2 points of view that are opposed and opposite. But Jesus isn't really doing that. Amy Jill suggests a different name for them, not antitheses, but extensions. Jesus isn't somehow opposing or seeking to replace Torah. He's extending it. He's making it more challenging. Or in Jesus' own words in today's gospel, he's fulfilling the Torah, not abolishing it. Jesus himself says before he starts these extensions of the Torah that he didn't come to abolish it. He's going beyond what even the best Jews, the scribes and the Pharisees, teach about the Torah and how to live it. It's so important to see that Jesus as a Jew is not contradicting his own religious upbringing. He's offering to fellow Jews a way of understanding their own scriptures, which takes them beyond previous teachings. And I think that's what I feel in my experience too, in my own conversion. It's not about abolishing what I grew up with, but enriching it, enhancing it, going beyond it, finding out that as great as it was for me growing up, the good news is even gooder. better. Jewish scholars like Amy Jill have helped me to understand this more clearly from the perspective of being Jewish, especially in ways that help me to appreciate and celebrate the Judaism of Jesus and Paul and the apostles, and to avoid denigrating it. But how do we understand that way in which Jesus extends and fulfills Torah if we have no previous experience with it? That Jesus is somehow breaking new ground here. And that's where another component of my conversion comes in, namely that one that I've named as an anthropology. That from the wider understanding of who we are as a species in the widest possible lens, we might begin to see more clearly that Jesus says our justice, our righteousness must ultimately exceed that of even the Pharisees and scribes. Why? Because Jesus is giving us a new way to be human. A new way to be human that goes beyond previous ways. He is the way and the truth and the life. Not in the sense of a religious conversion, but a human conversion. Of being human in a better and more true way. The way that God planned from the beginning. The Pharisees and the scribes, they represent already the best of the very best of human religion. But Jesus comes into the world representing a new way of being human that goes beyond any religion. So St. Paul saw right away that the Jesus movement was not about religious conversion. In many of his letters, we see him vehemently opposing making Gentiles convert to Judaism. He's fighting this thing that it's about converting to a certain religion. He saw that all religions up to that time had fallen short, even the best of them, like Judaism, that they had failed to help us as a species, precisely because in our different religions, we kept getting caught up in them in a way that kept us divided. Kept us divided. Jesus came to bring us God's way of being human, which goes beyond all the different religions to the extent that it is to become a way to reconcile the whole human family. Not to continue fighting over whose religion is best, but to seek together the best way of being human. So the Christian movement is not about religious conversion. It's about faithfully following Jesus in a new way of being human that brings the human family together to properly care for God's creation as God intended from the beginning. As such, the Sermon on the Mount represents a break from all previous human law or religion that came before it, with things like turning the other cheek in the face of violence, and even loving one's enemies. So then everyone within their own religions can go back to see how to understand their religion in terms of human reconciliation and unity rather than division. That's another reason why I hold Gandhi in such high regard, that he did that with his own religion. He took the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Jesus, to help him understand his own religious faith in a newer and truer way. he could see that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount was not about abolishing Hinduism either, but giving him a way to fulfill it as something to help bring the human family together instead of divide it. Human beings developed across this earth with a diversity of cultures and religions, not as excuses to give us to fight about our differences, who's right, who's wrong. No, the fulfillment of our diversity of cultures and religions gives us a way to listen to each other and hear what's right or wrong maybe about our own and others' traditions and cultures in a way that ultimately helps bring us together. That there is a greater creativity in diversity, a way to enhance each other's lives. Once again, the way that Paul sums it up is that the good news in Jesus Christ is God creating one new humanity in the place of two, in the place of all our divisions. That's the way he sums it up in Ephesians 2 and in many other ways throughout his letters. Things like Galatians, there's no longer Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. It's all about how we come together. And those old identities which used to keep us divided can help bring us together. So up to the point in human history where Jesus crosses all those violent boundaries between peoples, and he does that in his dying on the cross, the rulers and presiders over human cultures had always used our differences as reasons for division and war and ways to try to dominate one another. Jesus comes to expose this on the cross. And this is precisely what Paul means when he says in our second reading today, he's trying to help us understand the basic wisdom of the cross, this crazy thing that the Messiah should be executed on the cross. And he says, none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. I'd like to finish then with just a way, I think, that can help understand what he's saying there. For instance, if we go back again to what is a seminal part of my conversion, the civil rights movement, and what happened, say, in Selma in '65. As they were planning to make a march from Selma to Montgomery for the sake of voting rights. The mayor and the police chief in the town of Selma itself actually wanted to try to attract Northerners to come into Alabama and be welcome in Selma. So they wanted to help promote a more peaceful march and go along with that. But the sheriff in town, Jim Clark, and also the governor, George Wallace at the time, they were strict segregationists. They were for keeping us divided on racial lines. And so they chose to use force to try to stop it. And we've seen pictures of it because there were cameras there that day to record it for history. Now think of what Paul says. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. If Jim Clark had understood how his actions of trying to violently suppress that march would have turned out in history, would he have done it? Do you see? In the movie Selma, there's a scene where LBJ is sitting with George Wallace in the Oval Office. And he says, I don't know about you, George, talking to his fellow Southerner, but I'm going to choose to be on the right side of history on this one. And so he supported the Voting Rights Act. Jesus, in helping us to be human in a new way, I think, is behind this long history now that we are invited to be on the right side of, through things like the Sermon on the Mount. A way to be human that brings us together and reconciles the human family, rather than banking all the time on those things that divide us. Will we choose to be on the right side of history? Is that something that we can invite our friends and family and neighbors to be part of and feel good about it? Amen.